The Siege of Pensacola, May 1781, was one of the most strategically important and longest battles of the entire American Revolution, even though it is often overlooked in U.S. narratives. Its importance is clear in several major ways: strategic, global, and diplomatic. Strategically, Pensacola destroyed Britain's last foothold on the Gulf Coast. By capturing Pensacola, Spain closed the entire Gulf Coast to Britain, forcing the British to fight on fewer fronts and weakening their southern strategy. Globally, it was part of a wider war Britain was losing. The American Revolution was not just a colonial rebellion, it was a global war involving the colonies, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Spain's Gulf Coast campaign, Baton Rouge, Mobile, Pensacola, tied down thousands of British troops, ships, and resources that could not be used against General Washington. Pensacola was the culmination of Spain's campaign and one of Britain's most damaging defeats outside of the 13 colonies. Diplomatically, Pensacola strengthened the Allied position at the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Spain's victory gave it control of all West Florida, which Britain formally ceded in the peace treaty. This reshaped the map of the Southeast and gave Spain control of the Gulf Coast, control of the Mississippi River's mouth, leverage over American expansion for the next 15 years. Militarily, the Siege of Pensacola was one of the largest battles of the war outside the 13 colonies. It was a massive combined arms operation, naval, artillery, engineering, and infantry, on a scale larger than many battles fought in the colonies. Pensacola indirectly helped make Yorktown possible. By 1781, Britain was stretched thin. Spain's campaign forced Britain to divert troops and ships to defend the Caribbean and Gulf, abandon offensive plans in the Mississippi Valley, reduce pressure on the Continental Army. This helped the Franco-American forces concentrate on Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrendered later that same year. Bottom line, the Siege of Pensacola was one of the decisive blows that helped end the American Revolution. It removed Britain from the Gulf Coast, weakened their southern strategy, tied down major resources, and strengthened the Allied position in the final peace negotiations. Spain's contribution, especially General Galvez, was essential to the American victory, even though it happened outside the 13 colonies. General Bernardo de Galvez, governor of Spanish Louisiana, commanded the Spanish expedition that captured Pensacola, the capital of British West Florida, after a 2-month siege from March 9 to May 10, 1781. The operation was the culmination of Spain's Gulf Coast campaign during the American Revolutionary War. Our Longoria ancestor, Colonel Francisco Longoria y Garcia Castañon, played a pivotal leadership role during the opening days of the Siege of Pensacola, March to May 1781. As a high-ranking officer, he was personally entrusted by General Galvez with leading the first wave of Spanish forces onto the Florida coast near Santa Rosa Island. The following excerpt is translated from a pamphlet belonging to Mr. Gaspar Cusacks. During the rest of the day, other troops of the Army and Navy, with their officers, began to arrive, and a place was assigned to them, and so that all services should be rendered with due exactitude. The general ordered that the army be formed into 4 brigades. The first under command of Brigadier General Don Geronimo Giron, another under command of Colonel Don Manuel Pineda, another one under command of Colonel Don Francisco Longoria, the fourth under the command of the Capitan of Ships, Don Felipe Lopez Carrizosa, and the French division under command of the Capitan of Ships, Mr. de Boisderault. Francisco Longoria y Garcia Castañon, also known as Francisco Longoria Flores, was born on May 5, 1734, in San Martin, Consejo de Lina, Asturias, Spain. He was the son of José Longoria Flores Valdez and Rosenda Garcia Castañón and was married to Maria Francisca de Omana. His ancestry follows. Great-grandfather, Alonso Longoria, native of San Bartolomé either in Tineo or Belmonte de Miranda, and lord of the Casa de la Pontiga in the Consejo de Miranda. Grandfather, Pedro Longoria y Quiñones, also lord of the Casa de la Pontiga. Father, José Longoria y Flores, native of La Pontiga, Miranda. This places Francisco within the principal Asturian noble branch of the Longoria family, distinct from, but ancestrally connected to, the New Spain Longorias. In 1766, he was admitted as a knight in the Order of Alcántara, a prestigious Spanish military order. On the night of March 9, 1781, General Galvez ordered Colonel Longoria to lead the Grenadiers and Light Infantry, the elite vanguard of the army, in the first amphibious landing on Santa Rosa Island. This trust by the general in Francisco to command grenadiers and light infantry, the elite shock troops of the Spanish army, shows he was trusted for rapid assault, reconnaissance and amphibious operations. In 18th century warfare, grenadiers were the physically strongest and most experienced soldiers in the regiment, often used as the storming party for the most dangerous breaches. These were not ceremonial roles, they were the most dangerous assignments in the campaign. At 8 o'clock at night the signal was placed on the commanding ship so that the boats with troops should gather there, and the general having placed himself at their head, the landing was effected with some misgivings, but without the least opposition. He gave his orders to Colonel Longoria to take up the march with the grenadiers and light infantry, and he returned to the ship to hasten the final disembarking, so that by 3 o'clock in the morning of the 10th all the troops were marching in column formations by the sea on the shore of the referred to island. Leading the first wave at Santa Rosa Island was not just a position of honor, it was a high-risk reconnaissance and seizing mission. By securing the Punta de Sigüenza battery, Francisco and his troops provided the necessary ground cover that allowed the Spanish fleet to safely enter the bay. By early morning on March 10, Longoria's forces marched across the island and successfully seized the abandoned English battery at Punta Sigüenza. Punta de Sigüenza refers to Presidio Isla Santa Rosa. Punta de Sigüenza, a Spanish fort established in 1722 on the northern shore of Santa Rosa Island in Pensacola Bay, Florida. Francisco's seizure of the Punta de Sigüenza battery was the move that allowed the Spanish fleet to safely anchor, and eventually force their way past the British guns at Fort Barrancas, which is on current-day Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida. During this operation, Francisco and his troops captured the first prisoners of war, 7 British soldiers who had been sent to destroy supplies. Colonel Longoria oversaw the positioning of 2 24-pounder cannons brought ashore, which were used to return fire against the British warships, Mentor and Port Royal, eventually forcing them to retreat. Despite his successes, Colonel Longoria did not survive the campaign. Exhausted by exposure and fever after 2 months in the trenches, the siege of Pensacola was grueling, involving months of constant artillery bombardment and manual labor in the humid Florida trenches. His death highlights that officers often suffered the same physical toll as their men during the static phase of the siege. Colonel Longoria succumbed on May 13, 3 days after victory. Our ancestor's death places him among the officers who did not live to see the honors and promotions that followed. His sacrifice belongs to the final human cost of the Pensacola campaign. At the time of his death, he reportedly left his wife and 3 young daughters in Cuba where they were living at the time. This document, Archivo General de Simancas, Pensiones, Signatura, SU Leg 6846-13, Maria Francisca de Omana, Viuda de Francisco Longoria, Coronel que fue. Translation, Plaza de Pensacola. Plaza refers to a fortified military post or stronghold. Pensacola was the common 18th century Spanish spelling for Pensacola. Francisca de Omana, Viuda de Francisco Longoria, widow of Francisco Longoria. Coronel que fue, a legal phrasing meaning who was, or the late colonel list Francisca as his wife. This pensionez document is a critical find. It confirms that the Spanish crown recognized Francisco's death as occurring specifically in the siege, en el sitio, of Pensacola, and shows his widow was left in Cuba seeking financial support. His widow's petition for a pension from the Vacantes Mayores y Menores in Cuba was a formal recognition of his death in the line of duty. This type of pension was often reserved for families of officers whose service was deemed exceptional or essential to the crown's success. The pension request filed by his widow refers to a specific 18th century Spanish administrative practice. Because formal military pensions were not yet a universal right, families of high-ranking officers killed in action, specifically in a siege, petitioned for funds generated from vacant royal or ecclesiastical positions. This petition confirms that the crown viewed Longoria's death as a direct consequence of his combat leadership, a high honor for his surviving descendants. Francisco's military service represents the older Asturian noble tradition, from which the American Longorias ultimately descend. His presence at Pensacola links the family's Old World lineage to one of the decisive battles of the American Revolution. While Francisco represented the noble Asturian branch, His leadership at Pensacola represents the family's broader historical contribution to the founding of the Americas. His actions ensured the Gulf Coast was secured for the Allies, a legacy shared by all of us who carry the Longoria name.